you can click on the Show Closed Caption button down at the bottom of the screen. And the chat is open if you want to interact, but if you have any questions, we're asking you to use the Q&A feature. That way you can vote on questions that you would want to see answered in case we run out of time. We're going to get started with our session. As always, we are asking everybody to be mindful of UCR's principles of community. I'm putting the link in the chat right now if you need a refresh on what those are. Okay, so today you are all here for a session with Andrew Larratt Smith. Andrew has been the UC Riverside Ombuds since 2011. In his role, Andrew assists UCR in fostering a fair and healthy organizational climate for all members of the campus community. He does this by empowering campus community members who confidentially consult with him to navigate complex campus systems and resolve thorny dilemmas. Additionally, he facilitates dialogues for groups, delivers conflict-related workshops, and provides feedback and recommendations to administrators at all levels in the university on how to mitigate systematic challenges. In his work, Andrew draws upon his extensive experience in higher education and his training in alternative dispute resolution, coaching, mediation, facilitation, law, and campus ministry. Andrew holds a JD from UCLA School of Law with a specialization in critical race studies and a master's in dispute resolution from Pepperdine's Caruso School of Law. He serves as adjunct faculty for courses on ombuds practice at Pepperdine's Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution. Additionally, he is a member of the International Ombuds Association and the California Bar Inactive. Andrew is a proud Canadian and a board game enthusiast. He resides in Riverside with his spouse and children, who are the true fairness experts in the family. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. Glad to see so many of you here. I'm going to get started. I'm going to fire up the slideshow here. So here we go. Hopefully you all can see that. So that's the presentation. That's not fair. We're talking about operationalizing fairness. That's a mouthful. So that's what we're talking about today. We're going to start with a reflection exercise. So in just a moment, I'm going to have you join into some breakout rooms in pairs. And then we're going to talk about why is fairness important. And then I've got a model of fairness that hopefully is going to be useful and helpful to you today. So that's the overview of what we're going to talk about today. So here's the reflection exercise. So again, we'll divide you up into probably about pairs. Here are the questions to think about. Try to remember a time where you felt you were treated unfairly. And why was it that you think it was unfair? How did it make you feel? And how did you respond? What actions did you take or not take? So that's the question for reflection. I'll give you about 4 minutes in pairs. And I'm going to stop sharing now and just set up the rooms. Here we go. I'm going to post in the chat the questions there, so you've got them. And then we'll do the breakout rooms here. Okay. Breakout rooms. Where are the breakout rooms? Here we go. Okay, so see. Okay, and then you'll have 4 minutes, and then we'll come back together and debrief. So away you go. Hi, Kelly. We're doing some breakout rooms. I'm going to send you to one that's already in progress here. Oops. Hi, Brittany. How's it going?
It's going good. I'm just checking on everybody.
They're in breakout rooms right now. Hopefully that's working out. So
Awesome. Yeah, your session was the one that I wanted to watch. So after they get back from breakout rooms, I'm excited.
cool. Great. All right. Well, they'll be back in about 2 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. I'll go ahead and pop in a breakout room just to see what's going on.
Yeah. Hey, Brandy, folks are in breakout rooms. They're just coming back. Okay. Okay. Welcome back. Hopefully that was enough to get some juices flowing. I'd just love to hear from a few folks to share a little bit about what you shared in your breakout room. If we could just hear from a few people about the time you felt like you were treated unfairly, why you think it was unfair, how did it make you feel, and how you responded. Trina, thanks. Thanks for jumping in.
So I was with Alicia and we already know each other. So that was fun because we actually probably spent 3 of our minutes talking and not time discussing, but we were talking about miscommunications and how you don't always know the whole story. You know your side, but you don't know what's going on with the other person, and they may not feel willing or able to explain their side to you. So it gets to be tough when you're not hearing all the sides of a story.
Right. Yes, that's a great one. And I was just been working with some folks in the last week or so. That's a common one that comes up where people come in, they say, hey, I'm hearing that I'm being accused of something, but nobody's telling me what I'm like. And there's a story going around, but I don't know what it is. And yeah, and that can feel really unfair, right? Absolutely. Great. Other examples of things that came up in the meeting, in your little groups.
I'll jump in.
Thanks.
I was struggling to think of a work example, so I went back to being a teenager and how unfair everything was as a teenager, but particularly because I was a little sister to an older brother, and so he had a lot more privileges than I did. And my parents were a lot more protective about me, and with hindsight and being an adult, I can see where they were coming from, even if I still don't necessarily agree. But as a teenager, the reaction was very emotional. A lot of rebellion there.
Yes. So being a younger sibling, you definitely, right? So I was the oldest of four, so I didn't experience as much of that. I was more, the cause of some of those feelings. But yes, yeah, great. So great. Okay, so that's hopefully helping us to connect a little bit with what it means, how it feels, right? Like to be in a situation that's unfair. All right. So let's talk a little bit about why fairness is important. So what I want to start with first of all is an admission, right? In our family, this is my daughter, Junia. This is her from a few years ago. I'm not the fairness expert of the family, it's her, right? So that's not fair, right? So first of all, feel free to speak up or post in the chat. What is the appropriate parental response when a child says that's not fair? All right, life's not fair. Yes. Yes, right. So you can predict that. Yes, life's not fair. Get used to it, right? So that's really ingrained in us, right? So, but that's really interesting that that's a response we have, right? And that we all know, we kind of laugh about it. But what does it say about how we see this idea of fairness, right? So there's some knocks against fairness here, right? There's some concerns we have, like we don't always take claims of fairness very seriously. Sometimes it can feel really subjective and arbitrary, right? It's like, that's not fair. Because usually when a child says that's not fair, it means I don't like this. It's not good for me, right? It can be very self-interested, right? It can feel unrealistic. Like you got to get used to it. It's not fair. And this is why I love lacks grit, right? That's such a generational term, right? I feel like it's the boomers talking to the millennials. You don't have any grit, right? Like, just a bunch of whiners and complainers. Right? It could be a sort of generational piece or like right? Or the idea that there's some sort of, it's an invalid consideration, right? It's not something we're going to take very seriously. And I just think that's interesting that that's floating in our psyche around fairness, right? So, so my question for you is, why is fairness important? So let's kind of respond to some of these concerns, right? And these questions. So love to hear in the chat any thoughts about why you think fairness is important. I'm going to give you some of mine in a moment, but love to hear from you. Feel free to speak up as well. Builds trust with another person. Thank you, Heather. Feeling heard. Yes, Deb. For team building and morale. Great. Really good. Feel respected equally. Yes, Jane. Sense of being treated respectfully. Okay. Efforts towards equity. Good. Now they're flowing. Great. Excellent. Right. So this is good. So inclusion. Yes. All of them good. And we're going to hit some of these here. So and by the way, there's some resources and there's a resource section. If you look along your document, along the bottom of your Zoom, and there's 3 documents in there, including the slides from this presentation. So if you want to go look at those or access those, there's some resources that you can download. You don't need them for today's presentation, but just wanted to make sure you were aware of them. Okay, so let's look at why fairness is important. So the first is, so this one comes out to comply with laws and policies. Right? Yes, but that's a pretty low bar, right? So sometimes people talk about due process. I'm going to talk about fair process because due process is what's required by the law, but it's a low bar. We want to exceed that bar, right? So sometimes when we talk about legal issues, I get concerned that we're really kind of shooting for the lowest common denominator. And honestly, I would hope UCR is striving to be a better, fairer place than just what is the minimally legally required to be, right? We're not going to be a very good environment if that's what we're shooting for. But it is real, right? Yes, it's important for that. A second is this idea of innate need. So I'm going to show you a video here. I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to share again, different screen, if I can find the right one. Yep. And it'll share sound. So this is a video Here we go. Can everyone see it? Full screen? Okay, good. This is a video, and you should hear the sound in a moment. This is a video of some monkeys, and it's an experiment, and they're being given cucumber and grapes. So just watch what happens. It's a very short clip. Here we go.
Getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Okay. So, any thoughts about the video? What'd you think? Does that look at all familiar to you? Yeah, feel free again to comments in the chat or yes. Feel bad for the monkey, right? Yes, people are associating with that, right? There's that sense of, and did anyone notice how did the monkey deal with handle the cucumber the first time? Perfectly happy with the monkey with the cucumber the first time, right? It's only once the other monkey got the grape, then all of a sudden, hey, this is inequitable, right? So that is this innate reaction. And so I feel like that so happy, we're so able to see ourselves, right, in other primates, right, and how deeply this idea of fairness is inside of us, right? It's a sense of and how agitated, right, and disturbed that monkey becomes, right, when they see this thing, this unfairness. And so I feel like that's often people come talk with me about concerns, right? They're often got that sense of agitation about them because things are not fair. Okay, so it's this innate need. All right, so let me just see if I'm going to share again here back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so this idea that it's an innate need. Okay, another idea is aligning with organizational and ethical values. So people talked about that as well. It's an organizational value. I don't know if folks are aware of our UC standards of ethical conduct. We have standards of ethical conduct, and I believe there are 12 of them. And number one is fair dealing, right? And means of principles of fairness. So, that's part of what I'm doing this presentation today about is I feel like we talk about principles of fairness, but we haven't really talked about what they are specifically, right? And we talk about principles of community, but really kind of making that concrete and clear. How do we actually put that into action? And then diversity, equity, inclusion. So a lot of folks mentioned comments about that, right? And one thought I have on this is, right, inequities in our society and in our institutions, right, are not distributed equally. They're distributed unequally, right? It's not random. There are, particular groups that have been marginalized that are receiving more than their fair share of inequities. And so when we have unequal systems, unfair systems, that's going to have a disparate impact, right? So that's why we need to be mindful of it around diversity, equity, inclusion in particular, right? And that's even without even looking into the particular inequities that impact particular communities. And then this is a big one. I think this is really important. Often we talk about fairness, it's often framed from the person who's raising concerns about fairness, right? Rather than recognizing it's actually fairness in a lot of ways should be of greater concern to the folks in charge of the system and the leadership, because it's about the legitimacy of the system and its leaders and the processes. And if the people don't have faith in those, they begin to work around them. They begin to undermine them, right? And so the integrity of the institution and the structure begins to fall apart if people don't trust those structures and those, right? And so it's really important in that sense. And so I feel like that's often not, it's often framed from, that response to my daughter there, right? Let's not try to get used to it as if but it's important for those of us, and particularly who are affecting and designing systems, that we for the integrity of the leadership and the system. and not just the individuals. So those are some of the reasons, right? Great reasons from other folks. So what I want to do today is to put a model here that's actually a model of how that this might look like, right? What is a concrete way, some concrete steps, some ideas around what fairness can look like. So just a quick disclaimer, right? All models are wrong, some are useful. So this model is not complete. It's got some very specific principles, but right, it's not fully complete, and it's open to critique, and I would welcome that, right, and expansion. But these are some of the things I've seen that I think if we put these principles into practice, we will have better and more fair systems. So how can we find a useful, right? We want a useful, what's a useful model? So we want something that's going to be generalizable, it's going to be applicable in a lot of different settings, but it's concrete, and it's going to help provide some common language and norms around fairness that we can rely on and utilize, and then it's going to support a healthy climate and culture. So that's the goal, right? And as we're looking through it, I'm hoping we can use 3 different scenarios in the back of our head, right? So one scenario is, let's say you're overseeing a very formal investigation. So, and most of us are not doing that, but they're like sexual violence, sexual harassment, which is one of probably the most complicated, most rigorous, right, kind of formalized processes we have. Second scenario is thinking about campus change, system-wide change, right? So we see those come up every few years, the massive change. I mean, the current one is Impact 23, but that's the big one, but there's others as well, where new systems, new processes are put into place, right? And there's big changes that are happening, and are those being done in a fair way, right? So let's say you're charged with that. And then a third scenario here is you're supervising staff meetings, right, in your unit. So again, 3 very different scenarios, but we're trying to see if these principles, how would they apply in each of these? So let's keep those in mind. And again, you can think, I'd encourage you to think of somebody who's, as you're overseeing them, because it's really important that the folks who are overseeing them, right, think about fairness. But you can also imagine for we may not be overseeing all these things, so you may be experiencing them as well. So you can look through it that lens as well. But let's think of it, let's put ourselves in the mindset of those who actually have control over a lot of how these processes are being rolled out. Okay, so let's keep going here. So this is our model here. I've got basically 3 fundamentals of fairness. That's going to be the sort of basic ideas, or very simple framework around some sort of general rules around how fairness works, dimensions of fairness through ways it expresses itself, and then these principles, 10 principles of fairness. So we're going to go over these and apply those to those different scenarios. So here, away we go. So first of all, the idea is that fairness is principled, right? It's not entirely objective, but it's not entirely subjective either. It's very principled. So some people, one of the things I commonly hear is like, oh, fairness is like in the eye of the beholder. What's fair to you might not be fair to me. And there's some truth to, yes, there can be differences around fairness and ideas of fairness, but it's not like, if you go empty my bank account and take the money, like I think most people in this room, I hope, are going to agree that's not fair, right? We're going to have some common, right? So it's not totally relative. And so I get frustrated sometimes when folks are like, oh, but it's totally relative, as if, no, as if it doesn't matter. It does matter. It's very principled. And so as we look at it, we can actually find that there are significant principles that apply over and over and over in common situations. There's degrees of fairness. Okay, so we've got all the way, it's not binary. We've got all the way from patently unfair to unfair to fair to Snow White status. So does anyone know Snow White status? Why Snow White status?
She's the fairest of them all.
Yes. You got to work in a dad joke. Sorry, everyone. Snow White, there's some problems with Snow White. I just want to acknowledge that, right? We don't ever that's not a real, she's not real. It's not even in some ways idealized. But the idea is we can always be moving more fair or less fair, right? And improving. And it's not just a binary, it's fair or unfair. There's degrees, right? And then it's context dependent. So that means depending on the situation you're in, the rules of fairness may vary in terms of how important they are and how important to have them in place. So going back to our scenarios, right? In the sexual violence, sexual harassment investigation, it's going to be very important to have some really good, firm fairness around that investigation, because that the impact could be serious, right? Whereas a staff meeting, also important, but right, may not need to have as strict or formalized rules of fairness, right? So there's some flexibility depending on the context and the severity and the impact. So that's why there's not a one size fits all solution, but again, the principles apply. So those are our fundamental fairness that sort of describe the soup that we float in terms of fairness. Then here are 3 dimensions of fairness. So the first is substantive fairness, and that has to do with, is the outcome fair? So in any decision, right, is the outcome fair? Is the results of the sexual violence, is the outcome about that fair? If the implementation of the system, campus system-wide, is it done in a fair way? Is it implemented fairly, right? Is the staff meeting, or the decisions that come out of that staff meeting, are they fair, right? So you're focusing on outcomes. But that's what's interesting. So often that's where we start. We think of fairness as substantive fairness, the outcomes. But what's interesting is actually there's this procedural fairness that often what's actually even more important than the outcome is the process. So let me give an example of the 2 children, 1 cookie example, where you're trying to distribute a cookie to 2 children, right? So a substantive solution to that would be to try to break the cookie in half and give, each half to each child. But as we know, cookies don't always break perfectly in the middle, right? So there's procedural solutions of there's the I cut, you choose, right? That's a procedural solution that increases fairness, right? Or there's some cookies that don't cut, right? Like, so it could be something that's not divisible. So then we might do rock, paper, scissors, right? Whoever gets is going to, and that outcome, that substance outcome could seem fair. Only 1 child gets the cookie or the object, right? But if the process has been done fairly, then there's going to be far less likelihood of tears if there's a process of rock, paper, scissors than if you just hand one child the object, right? We all know this. So this idea of process is really important. How do we think about our processes? And that actually, when people experience fairness, often a lot of the concerns around fairness are around process. And even more than process, and a lot of the social science backs this up, is how are people treated in this process? So relationally, right, how are they treated and attended to? So again, if the cookie problem, if I'm yelling at my children while I'm going through this, even if the outcome is fair, even if the process is fair, if they're experiencing aggression, right, or like that's going to be a very painful, difficult process for all of us, right, if they're not treated well in that process. And again, that often is more important than even the outcome or the process, is how do people treated, feel like they're treated with care and dignity. So these are the different dimensions of fairness, right, and something that we can think across in all the different processes that we're looking at. Okay, so these are some of the basics. Now I really want to dive into different principles. And this is, we're going to go through, there's 10 different principles, and love to hear from you. Feel free to respond to the chat or ask questions as we're going through this about these different principles and how they might apply, right? So proportionality is that similarly situated people are treated similarly, and differently situated people are treated differently. So, and now this can be applied both in terms of the outcome, right, is proportional, but then also the process is people are treated, how are given similar process. So one of the challenges here with this approach to proportionality is like, what is similarly situated, right? There's a lot of debate around that, so it's hard to get that, what differences matter. But it's really important, for instance, in a Title IX investigation, right, that if somebody accused of sexual assault might be getting a worse punishment than somebody who's, a relatively less serious concern about sexual harassment, right? There'd be varying, it's not going to be the same punishment, right? It's proportional. Right. So we want to be able to make sure that the outcomes or the sanctions match, punishment fits the crime. That's a proportional idea. Similar, like what about in a staff meeting, right? What would proportionality be in a staff meeting? Maybe it's that, people are getting sufficient time, right? Or attention in the staff meeting, are getting treated similarly as they're coming in and greeted, right? Around the table. Okay. Accessibility is this idea that to work really hard to make information fully comprehensible to all participants, especially the least informed. So this comes up a lot. One of the dynamics with processes is, especially like some of the more formal processes, like sexual harassment investigations, the folks conducting those processes are very familiar with them because they do them every day. That's their job, right? And the people going through them are not very familiar with them because hopefully, they don't go through that regularly. So now they're confronted with a lot of confusion about what's the process, what's this information, and they don't control the process. So there's huge differences often in understanding of power in terms of information and what's being communicated. And the challenge with this idea of accessibility is working really hard to kind of level the playing field and make that information available to everyone. And again, it's a never-ending task. You will never achieve this perfectly, but the more you do it, the better. And the more complicated a process, the harder it is to do that in a way that's really understandable. So here's at the bottom, I've got some implementation strategies, right, of how you might implement and think about when you're putting into processes, how do you make it accessible to involve to everyone? Okay, confidentiality, I'm just going to touch on briefly, but this idea that in some ways it goes well with accessibility. It's that there's some information that can't be shared, that can't be made transparent, that should be kept confidential. And it's tricky sometimes to figure out what that information is, but it's often very sensitive information, and confidentiality is complex, right? So we want to be clear about what information needs to be kept confidential under what circumstances and why. And so often I hear people say, oh, this is confidential. It's like, okay, but what do you mean and how and when, right? And sometimes there's this tension between confidentiality and being sensitive about confidential information and then using confidentiality to avoid transparency, right? So there's a tendency there to do that. So you've got to be careful and thoughtful, but there definitely does need to be some information that's kept confidential, right? So Title IX investigation, you don't want it announced to everyone that somebody's going through it, right? There's a lot of confidentiality concerns. Similarly, like maybe in a staff meeting, if somebody knows that somebody else is pregnant, for instance, that's medical information that shouldn't be divulged until that person is ready to share that information, right? So there's confidential information that needs to be kept and kept private. Okay. So voice is a really important and interesting concept. And it's interesting here, you see voice is the name, but I've got the ear as the icon. And the reason for that is it involves listening often and providing those who are impacted by decisions an opportunity. That's the important thing, is that giving people who are being impacted opportunity to participate meaningfully, right? To be heard. And so this is one that often needs a lot of work and a lot of attention to really creating that space for people to be heard. So a great example for this is that change management, right? That process, often those processes require a huge amount of voice, right? A lot of engagement with stakeholders, listening and understanding how it's going to impact them. And that's where a lot of those fail or falter, right? Is they don't involve enough listening, especially to people who are being impacted, right, early on, to get that information, to allow people to have that opportunity to bring concerns up, and both substantively because they're able to bring their concerns up and have them addressed by the system. So hopefully the change will go better, but also it's also to make sure they're included, they feel included and engaged, right, and have ownership. And if they don't have an opportunity to feel heard, that won't happen. So voice is really, it's one of these concepts that's really important. And just so you know, these concepts are really helpful. I used them a week and a half ago at a school board meeting. I got up and spoke and said, hey, I think this process is missing some of these, right? And it was effective. I got a message across. The board was actually in their comments back was reflecting back because I got through. So these can be really helpful and effective if you're able to use this language to communicate, okay, where are things not being fair, where are fairness principles not being met? Okay, and voice was one of the big ones that I highlighted. So timeliness is this right, time frames, and they're tricky. And this is what a lot of these have, this kind of Goldilocks principle where you need like just right, not too much, not too little, because you won't need to keep processes moving. But if you don't give enough time for people, then they don't have the opportunity to respond. And often, I would say here, one of the things that happens is the people in control of the process often are taking the time they need, but they may not be giving others the time that others need. And so really being aware for others of like what the time they need. And then also communicating really generously in that when things are slow. Because that's one of the things I've learned in this job that has sort of surprised me, is how frustrating and anxious people get when they're waiting or when something's dragging on, particularly when it's a serious, significant process that impacts them heavily, right? So being really attentive to timelines and timeliness is really important. And it relates a lot when you think of those dimensions, right? It's process, but this is one that really shows up relationally, because how people feel about how they're being treated. Okay, impartiality is really about the decision makers and whether they are trustworthy and have no personal stake in the outcome. One of the challenges within organizations is that, first of all, we have all sorts of bias, including unconscious bias, but also in organizations, decision makers are wearing a lot of hats. And so they're not necessarily in a place where they're really, truly unbiased and impartial. So let's look at the example of our staff meeting, for instance, right? Usually the person leading that meeting is a supervisor. They have all sorts of roles as supervisor other than running that meeting. They're also the one who writes the performance appraisals for most of the people in the room, probably, right? They also, right, delegate tasks. So they have their, whatever decisions are being made, they're accountable for those decisions. So they're to their supervisor, right? So they're not unbiased, right? They're not fully removed and impartial. And that's just a reality of a situation that we often are working with. So there are ways of addressing some of these things. So like one is this final point here is how can you spread authority around? Sometimes having panels or checks and balances or delegating tasks. Maybe you can have somebody facilitate the meeting and somebody else, right? So you're splitting roles, and that helps create a sense that there's impartiality and trust, right? So that's a key feature of making sure people feel like the process is fair. Rationality is this idea of providing a well-reasoned decision based on relevant information. So I often think of this like kind of like a math problem. You want to show your work because that helps show how we get from A to B to C to D, right, all the way through in the decision making. And one of the challenges is it's actually very hard for people to do that. I see this and I look at like those Title IX investigations or others investigations generally. I notice that it's very hard for investigators or people to really spell out, because they're so easy as humans to make logical leaps and not really lay out every step along the way. Or there are other ways we often just make decisions. We don't make decisions based on reason. We make them on emotion, and then we rationalize after the fact. So, but this is important to try to really be very clear and transparent about how we're reasoning and how we're getting to our decisions. Then people feel like that process is fair, the more, right, the reasoning that's provided. Accountability mechanisms, right? This is a commitment to own and correct and monitor improved processes. So, but one of the challenges is often this kind of review is really time consuming, and it often gets sort of put to the bottom of the priority list. And sometimes I notice too, like appeals processes or review processes, they often say like appeal to the vice chancellor of such and such unit will make a decision, has the final authority on it. But those folks are really busy, and they're often not as engaged with the process and the details of the process. So you get sometimes this challenges where the folks who are reviewing it are not that familiar and don't have a lot of time and attention. And so that creates this tension between, having appropriate authority, but also having sufficient expertise and knowledge. Makes it really hard to get some of these review processes to work properly. So And also, I think generally speaking, whenever you try to fix something after the fact, it's so much harder and so much worse than trying to get it right the first time. So yes, you want to anticipate and create processes that are going to allow for review and to recognize that errors are going to be made, but also how do you like rigorously cut down on them and try to prevent them. There's so many times I wish I've wanted to say to people, I wish I had a time machine. I don't, right? That would solve the problem. We don't have a time machine though, so we can't go back. What do you want to do at this point to try to improve things? But it's hard. This 9th principle is flexibility. So, and this is important because the rules are not perfect. And so, but there's this tension between how do we become overly rigid in the rules and how do we, versus getting to total discretion where the exception swallows the rule and the rule doesn't even matter anymore. Right. So what is the right level of discretion? Another kind of Goldilocks problem here. One of the things, here's a couple of pointers I think are really important around this principle around flexibility, to really look at and challenge what's the underlying spirit and intent of the relevant policies or procedures, and are those being followed? And I wish we would ask that question more often, because that really helps lead people to know, like, when is an exception good? Is it, what's this trying to do? And is it accomplishing it? Because no matter how well the policies and rules are written, they're not going to hit that 100% of the time. And I think that informs when to make a good exception, or trying to get how do you manage when, like, an exception, how would this exception apply generally? And often I find there's good exceptions are ones that apply to a relatively small subgroup. So it keeps the general rule intact, but it creates an exception for a small group of people and allows. So that's something to consider as you're trying to think about exceptions. You know, how can we define this? Can we define it in a way that applies to a relatively small group of people? And then it makes it easier to actually move forward. Whereas some folks get very nervous about any exception at all because they're just worried, I can't make an exception because then it'll just kill the rule. And then finally, dignity, which really, again, relates a lot to the idea of the relational fairness on that dimension. And it's acknowledging the inherent value of individuals and treating them accordingly, right? So a couple of things here I want to emphasize, this idea of empathy, really considering the process from the perspective of those who find it most difficult. One of the challenges I see all the time is when I'm working with folks who are, like, particularly students, they'll say, oh, UCR, and they're seeing UCR as a single unit. And they've got a frustration with somebody who's made a decision. And I go talk to that person, they're like, oh, no, it's not our department, it's this department, right? And so, but from the perspective of the student, they don't care that it's X department or Y department, right? They're caring that it's not, that it's impacting them. And I think that kind of thinking, especially from staff, is really important to have that empathy to think about what's the perspective of the person who's experiencing it, especially finding it most difficult, and how to look at it from that vantage point. And how do we also, this idea too, that we can really, it's so dangerous when these processes get tense and there's conflict, it's really easy to treat people badly because it's just human nature. When people start behaving badly, we treat them badly. Or if the process is adversarial, it justifies and rationalizes poor behavior. So being really sticklers for how do we continue to respect people in the midst of these tensions. So I think we're at time, but we've got through all of these different principles. Hopefully they're helpful and can be applied to your work situation. I'd be happy to talk more. I think we're done for the session, but if you want to stay afterwards, I think I can take some questions, some Q&A.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, now's the time. We hope you've enjoyed the session today. As you know, our goal is to keep the staff conference 100% free to attend. We couldn't do that without the generous support of our sponsors. That's UCR Staff Assembly, LEAD, HR, and Schools First Credit Union. All the conference sessions will be uploaded to UCR's learning management system. And then we do have a few quick reminders. If you're still here, we do have a closing session that's in person. If you want to register, we do still have spots available for that. You can fill out the Google form in the chat. LEAD nominations are open right now, and staff assembly elections will be starting next week. So make sure to vote, and then you can sign up for the EOD listserv at the link in the chat as well. Thanks again for joining. If anybody has any questions, now's the time. I think you just covered it so well, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what it is. Now it's all figured out. Trina, thanks for, you have a
I'm
question?
sorry, I always have something to say, but
Okay.
I put in the chat that one of the hardest things for me is keeping emotions out of decisions, because the work that I do all has to do with policies and applying them to certain particular student situations. And so that's really tough because the student is often emotional about it, and that kind of transfers to me as I'm talking to the person. So it's so hard to say no to somebody when their emotions are getting the best of them. Do you have any suggestions for how to mitigate that?
I don't think it's realistic to take emotions out entirely, and I think actually emotions are very relevant. It's just, so maybe I guess the question would be like, what's driving those emotions? Like, because emotions are often reflecting, right? So, and so it's looking and hearing and being empathetic. I think that's a relational piece, is like responding and acknowledging and like reflecting back the emotions and saying, and being empathetic there. I think we can do that regardless of whatever decision gets made, right? But then also trying to explore, like, well, okay, what's driving this emotion? Where are they coming from? And then that's where some of these principles come into play, because you can, for me, it's been helpful to be like, oh, okay, they're really upset because it's voice. This is a voice issue. They haven't felt heard, right? And so then I can sometimes reframe what they're saying, which is just frustration, into, okay, it sounds like, it was issue about being heard. And now that's actually more effective, right? In terms of them raising that concern or being able to address it, because now it's more like we're able to translate the emotion into something more actionable.
Thank you. That's super helpful. I appreciate it. Takes a lot of practice.
Yeah.
Working on it.
Yeah. Do you have other thoughts about that? What have you found has been useful?
Yeah, I think we talk about that a lot in our staff meetings, about how to listen. My supervisor is especially good at giving people space, and I think that's something that I need to work on, is making sure that a person has space to say the things that they need to say before I jump into solution mode.
Yep.
Because like you said, we're all very busy, and so sometimes you're thinking, well, I only have 5 minutes to talk to this person and I need to solve this as soon as possible. So like maybe even saying to myself or to the person, it sounds like there's a larger issue that we need more time to discuss. How about if we make an appointment so we can talk for a half an hour instead of 10 minutes? Stuff like that. It's hard to check myself in those situations.
Yeah. So see, there's a question about the slides, and thanks, Sarah, for jumping in on that. They're in the resources tab. If you go in the bottom and click on resources, they're the slides. There's also a checklist in there that is handy dandy little checklist. And also there's a kind of a document that goes into more depth than some of the slides, if you're interested. It's an older document, so it's organized a little differently. I'm kind of refining this material, but it has more information if you're looking to unpack it some more. They're also posted on our website, not the slides, but the resources. My screen has gone blank, and people, oops, did my computer just die?